Welcome to a special edition of A Touch of Multiplatform. KotlinConf is around the corner, and this year includes 2 workshops focused squarely on Kotlin Multiplatform. So Pamela and I thought we should invite the workshop facilitators on the show for a double feature. Today we'll talk to Kevin, Tadeas, and Russell about their workshop Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile in production. And later on the show, we'll have Garth Gilmour on to discuss his workshop Multiplatform Madness with Compose. Now, as Pamela and I were preparing for this episode, we somehow got into the topic of adulting, and we realized there are still adulting things that we should know how to do, but don't. For instance, my cooking skills only go ever so slightly past the ability to reheat. What's an adulting thing you don't know how to do, Pamela?
I still can't parallel park, but it's not necessary in South Africa, so it's fine. Hello everyone, my name is Pamela Hill. I'm a developer advocate for Kotlin at JetBrains. Kevin, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Kevin Galligan. I'm the technical partner and founder of Touchlab, and just a sort of I focus on Kotlin Multiplatform all day. Essentially, that's kind of what I do.
Tadeas.
Hi, I'm Tadeas. I'm a senior mobile developer at Touchlab, and I'm mostly doing KMM, but mostly the tools around it. And yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Russell.
Yeah, I'm Russell Wolf, and I also at Touchlab, senior mobile developer, doing KMM all day.
Now, we're not going to ask you about your adulting mishaps, but we do want to know, in terms of your working style, what's a seemingly insignificant thing that makes your work day so much better? And that's for everybody.
I think for me, it's I don't know. It's having something early in the day and seeing people and not being just like totally alone in my home office, but not too early in the day because we had that problem.
Yeah, I do agree with that. That's definitely something that is great. And then we also have with my other colleague these pair programmings in my morning, his afternoon, where it really feels like we're in the same office. So even just staying there on the Zoom call, not really talking about anything, but being in the same space.
Yeah, I like the FaceTime, but I also when I have days where I look at the schedule and it's like all my meetings are compacted to the morning, and then there's just this big open space in the afternoon where I can just kind of code and go deep. Unfortunately, I'll often get a message every 45 minutes like, hey, you got a minute? And then it takes you right out of the mode. So sometimes I just pretend like I'm not here.
All things in moderation.
Where he's too important.
No, I'm not. But everyone feels like, hey, you're here. Let me distract you for 2 minutes. I'm like, about non-tech things. What do you think of this logo? I'm like, I don't care.
Kevin, let me distract you with something else.
Okay.
What can folks expect from your workshop? If we can sort of segue into the bulk of our podcast, what can we expect from your workshop?
Well, yeah, I mean, the exact run of show we're still trying to nail down because there's a lot of content and really, although the workshop is fairly good chunk of time, we're not going to be able to cover everything, right? But the overview of what we're going to talk about is really what we've been working on as a team for the last few years now. I mean, it's been really since 2018. We've been helping teams put KMM into production. And while, I mean, the docs are great, the getting started docs are great. But like any ecosystem, once you get into really going into production, there's a lot of things that you don't come across that the average developer that's trying out a technology or an individual developer that's trying out technology don't really run into. And that is essentially what the workshop is going to try to cover in a nutshell. So obviously things around team organization, repo organization, how does everyone contribute? And a lot of teams, especially as they get larger, not necessarily everyone's going to edit Kotlin, not necessarily everyone, not every team works the same way. And that's the thing we've learned over the years. And not every mode of operating is going to be successful. And then as you get further into it, there are patterns that emerge. So often, for obvious reasons, the Kotlin editing starts more with the Android team. But the Android team doesn't necessarily know much about Swift or what the Kotlin multi-platform code is going to look like to Swift. And there's a lot of understanding of how to craft an API that is not going to be unfriendly, let's say, to somebody who is a Swift developer. And there's a lot of that to learn. And there's also anxiety around that for the developer because they don't want to produce something that's going to be not good. So we start them along the path of that. And then there's production concerns like binary size, like header size. What should you export libraries? Should you use transitive export? Spoilers, probably not. So there's a lot of that stuff. Too much for one session because we've been doing this for years, but we're going to try to at least cover the big stuff and then start on a good path to go from there.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you fit all of that into one session?
You don't.
Clearly, you don't.
You don't, but you can cover big ticket stuff and then point to other things. And obviously, like, not to, this is not a sales presentation, but obviously we exist to help people do this. So, check out the website at least.
Tadeas, what do you think is going to be most exciting for you to teach at the workshop?
I'm really excited about the Swift API side of KMM, where we're doing a lot of work to kind of help with that, with like where Kotlin is currently has some rough edges. Because I'm an iOS developer mostly, hopefully. I can spend a lot of time with Swift. So the calling Kotlin from Swift and how to make great API is important, and it's definitely important for iOS developers who may not want to go into this new territory of Kotlin Multiplatform. So making that as smooth for them as possible is important, and I hope that that's gonna be like the main thing to take for the iOS side, and for like when Android developers do this, they will know what to not use or where to use things like SKIE, where it brings that in.
What is SKIE?
So SKIE, it's an acronym, and no one really remembers the name. But it's
what it's supposed to stand for.
Yeah.
Let's spend 10 minutes of this to come up with names for it.
Anyway, it's a tool that kind of smooths the rough edges of the API that you see from Swift when you have a Kotlin multiplatform library. So basically, like bringing in stuff that you would expect in a modern language, like exhaustivity on enums, on sealed classes, support for calling suspend functions, and using flows as you would use any other like async built-in stuff in Swift directly.
And you were talking about the smoothness of, like, for iOS developers. This is going to be helping with that, but it didn't exist when you got started. When you first heard of Kotlin Multiplatform, where were you on the spectrum of like being dismissive or embracing it?
So the good thing is that I had prior Android experience and I used Kotlin before. So when the Kotlin multiplatform kind of started and then I was looking into it, I was very excited about it, because like reusing logic for like reusing code for the application logic, reusing it for business logic, and then reusing tests was something that was super interesting. And I really wanted to go all in. I know that other iOS developers are not as enthusiastic about it. And one of the reasons is that you do need to have workarounds around the like roughness of the API.
So, Kevin, what do you think the biggest challenge is for folks wanting to start with Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile?
Well, that question, I think it depends on there's individuals and teams, and the problems are different depending on the teams, and that's kind of a bigger topic. I don't even want to go into that, but because there's a lot of different team forms. But individuals, I think, especially again going back to a lot of the folks who start doing Kotlin are more on the Android side, and I think the challenge that they face is similar to the challenge that any other cross-platform situation is going to have, which is the idea is that you don't have to learn the other platform. You can do both platforms with one code base. The reality is you need to understand the other platform in detail in order to be very productive, or at least, and we kind of do a sliver of the other platform, right? Like I tell people that when they're new on the team, because there is some anxiety from our new team members that they're like, they don't understand iOS as well. You know, how it's going to take a long time to learn. And I'm like, look, you have to understand certain things quite well, which are not necessarily the most common things, such as the build systems, linking, all that stuff. And conversely, there's other things you don't really need to understand. An iOS developer would need to be very good, such as if you ask me to write an iOS screen with Swift, it better be like straight up and down, and don't worry about the width, because I don't know how to do UI at all on iOS. But I do know how to write a SQLite driver for iOS with Kotlin. So there is that is kind of the challenge, is getting that knowledge and getting it to a functional level, and then being able to again create APIs that an iOS developer would be comfortable calling. And then conversely, as a team, you do want to get the iOS side to be more involved. So it's not just this handoff, and you never get to edit Kotlin. It's better if everyone kind of starts to do that. And so the iOS developers need to understand how Android works and how the Android ecosystem works and the JVM, and why are there these exceptions that go up the stack, whereas Swift that's not a thing. Like there's all that kind of stuff. I think that's really the big challenge is understanding that. At the team level, it's all kinds of stuff. There's politics, there's source organization, there's again binary size, there's all kinds of things you got to get used to. And build systems is a big one. CI, it's all stuff that everyone is doing for the first time, and because it's a new ecosystem, a lot of this production level stuff is not as available. So that's kind of I think the big challenge.
Question always comes up: is Kotlin Multiplatform ready for production? And the thing is, people have been using it in production since 2019. So what's your take on that?
Well, my joke is that doesn't compile. It's not a Boolean, right? It's not yes or no. It's not true false. It is it good enough for you? Are you comfortable with where it's at? And there's a lot of stuff that I've been talking about for a while. Like before KMM went to beta, people are like, well, it's still in alpha. I'm like, the build tools are technically in alpha. The runtime is not. Like it depends on what you're talking about. Are you worried about the thing crashing in production? Are you worried about unknown memory leaks, all that kind of stuff? Like there's no spontaneous crashes in the runtime in production. The tooling might change some. So are you comfortable with that? And if you're an old big bank, probably not. Are you a startup? Like you should be, because you're doing all kinds of crazy stuff every week. So like, it depends on what you're doing.
Russell, you built one of the first libraries that I'm sure lots of people are using in production. What have been the challenges as at the time when you were learning Kotlin Multiplatform to make this, and then what are the newest challenges you're running into now?
Yeah, so I made the multi-platform settings library, which is kind of your shared preferences equivalent in multi-platform land. And yeah, I mean, early on, there was very little else there to learn from. Like there was like that first summer, there were maybe like 4 or 5 libraries in total. And 3 of them were JetBrains. So like figuring out, and I had never done a library before. So I was kind of learning how to do everything all at once. So it was a lot of kind of looking at what JetBrains was doing, like copying little bits of Gradle scripts, trying to figure it all out. No IDE support for half the things we're trying to do yet. So things have come a very long way in the last 5 years. These days, I mean, for that library, my challenges are more around figuring out, like, there's it hits a bunch of different platforms now. I'd love it to hit a couple more, but what are the APIs to talk to on different platforms, and figuring out kind of what the best user experience is for that.
Russell, since there's only so much space at the workshop, only so many tickets being sold, but a lot of people are going to be interested in like how this all comes together. What resources should they be looking at if they can't join?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of stuff that JetBrains puts out on the Kotlin page in terms of documentation and getting started and things like that. There's plenty of stuff that we at Touchlab put out, blog posts and things. We're starting to offer we're starting to offer some kind of self-directed training and access to some of our internal documents and best practices. So that's a lot of what I've been working on recently, actually, is kind of getting some of that stuff in writing. So that is a thing you can kind of come talk to us about if you're interested.
And by the way, there's only one ticket of your workshop left.
So, good to know.
Yes, only one.
So by the time people actually hear this, if that can be sold, we'll see.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. I wanted to know from pretty much everyone, what is your big dream for folks attending this workshop? Let's start with Tadeas.
Big dream.
Your big ambition.
Basically, for people who are not using KMM now and are going there with like any mindset, if the mindset is being skeptical about KMM or being enthusiastic, the dream is that they end up being enthusiastic the same way we are, or at least to some degree. It's probably difficult to be as enthusiastic about it as we are. But basically being open to using it in their project, in their product, and putting their KMM stuff into production. So basically helping them with all that.
Cool. You, Russell?
I hope that they feel empowered to do more than they realize they could do. A lot of people, when they're just getting started, there's a different sort of project style that you end up doing than when you're actually trying to integrate it into your real existing production app. And my hope is you start to kind of see more of the possibilities.
Kevin.
Interface is not expect actual. Except for factory functions, which are quite useful. So I will say one of the things I really like, and this happens periodically when you spend a lot of time on Slack answering questions and stuff, you will get somebody that comes back and says, hey, like, we did it. Like, you know, we presented to the team, we got this integrated, we're using it. And that's, we've had a few of those. That's fun. And I hope that comes, like, obviously not that day, it's going to be down the road, but we get some of those. I do think that, like, oftentimes in team environments, again, there's I would say a healthy skepticism to another cross-platform thing from the iOS or other sides. Anybody else is like, yeah, we've done this before. We went down this road and it didn't work. Or I did React Native at my last company and everyone hated it and we pulled it out. Here's a blog post. Here's another one. So as someone who's advocating for the technology, especially if you're new, I think that there's a healthy anxiety around, they're going to ask me questions that I can't answer. And I hope that you leave that session with the answers, or at least enough of them to feel comfortable and enough knowledge to go to resources to answer those questions. And I think as we decide and run a show, we're probably going to leave a pretty solid amount of time purely for questions, because it's such a wide topic. And sometimes, we're really surprised you'll get a question you never would have thought of from somebody, and it turns out to be a really interesting piece of information kind of for everybody. Like a lot of our biggest insights were just somebody dropping a question casually, and you're like, wow, that's interesting. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. And I'm sure the sales team is hoping for leads, but we'll see how that goes.
Amazing. Folks, thank you so much for your time, Kevin, Russell, Tadeas. Thank you for spending some time with us. All the best in Amsterdam. All the best with your workshop. Go knock 'em dead.
And now it's time to welcome Garth Gilmour, who will be holding a workshop at KotlinConf called Multiplatform Madness with Compose. I don't know if I should be scared, but I am intrigued. We'll learn more about the workshop later, but for now, Garth, let's learn a little bit more about you. Please introduce yourself.
Well, my name's Garth Gilmour. I work for a company in Belfast called Instill. Instill is a software development company. We partner with other companies in software projects. And we also have a services division that does training, consulting, mentoring, all that kind of thing. So I run that side of the business, and I've been there for 10 years now. I've been playing around with Kotlin for well over 5 years now, and I'm a GDE for Kotlin.
Lovely. So, Garth, we always start with a little icebreaker. And what we want to know from you today is what food, like what delicacy is your city or country known for? And do you actually like it?
Well, Ireland, of course, Ireland is famous for potatoes. If you go to a hotel in Ireland, you'll order a dish, and the dish will be served with mash, and then they'll ask you what kind of potato you would like. So in certain hotels in Ireland, I've been served with 3 kinds of potatoes at the same time.
Can't go wrong with that.
Belfast, I have to say tray bakes. Yeah. So whenever we run developer events, there have to be tray bakes, and there's this war that goes on between people who like 15s and people who like caramel squares. Yeah. Do you know what 15s are?
I know what caramel squares are.
Oh, 15s are brilliant. It's just 15 different ingredients, yeah? And you put them in a bowl and you mix them all up and you put them in the fridge and you've got 15s, and they're absolutely brilliant. So the homework, guys, and everybody watching this recording is go and look up 15s and bake some, just put them in the fridge for the weekend. They're great. So there's people who like 15s, and then there are people who like caramel squares. And whenever we have a developer event, there's always a mad kind of religious war about which kind of tray bakes we're going to provide. So we try and provide both. And then there are people who like normal caramel squares, and then there are people who like mint caramel squares, and they don't always get along either. But yes, no, I would say in Belfast, tray bakes are definitely the thing whenever it comes to developer events.
Yeah,
Can you put the caramel squares in the 15s?
Ooh,
because that's what I want to do.
Oh, you're mixing your chocolate and your peanut butter there. I'm not entirely sure. Either everybody would get on, or that developer event might turn into a smoking crater. I'm not sure.
It's like a sugar high. So I just wanted to mention, because I always mention, like, from South Africa, we have XYZ, and I think it's probably working on Justin's nose by now. But in South Africa, we have koeksisters, and they are like these plaited, doughy, kind of, they're sort of fried dough in syrup, but they're sort of plaited as well, and they're very tasty because they're crunchy on the outside and syrupy and mushy in the middle. But everyone has like their koeksister style of choice. But then in the Cape Malay style, we have koesisters, which is something completely different, and there's one K missing, and it's like completely different thing, completely different. It's also kind of sweetish, but that's also a delicacy. But I like koeksisters. Yeah,
that does sound lovely.
Maybe I'll bring with.
I did live in Australia for a while, so a lot of different plaited stuff. That was the first time I ever heard of that sort of thing being done to breads and pastries. It was really cool. enough about our favorite foods, and let's dive into the workshop
our favorite
now.
Technologies.
Yes, or maybe Compose can be used to create different 15s and breads and everything. But
you just suggested a very interesting exercise for the workshop there. So yes, I'll have to think about that. Yeah, you're using Compose for baking and for recipes and so on. So it is you do compose ingredients together to bake things. So yeah, there's a use case there somewhere. So.
All right, so if you're at KotlinConf, make sure you're signed up for the workshop, and you'll learn how to compose ingredients together. Maybe that's what the madness is. What do you really expect people to learn from the workshop?
Well, the workshop is based around the big picture for Compose. So most people who do Kotlin, they've heard of Compose as an Android technology, but Compose isn't just for user interfaces in Android, and in fact, it doesn't have to be for any kind of user interface at all. It's anywhere where you want to build a tree structure, and that tree structure is in some way going to lead to something else. And that other thing doesn't have to be a user interface; it could be something completely different. So we'll be exploring how you can use Compose to build desktop applications and how you can build web applications. And as part of that, we'll be doing deep dives into things like how state management is performed, how side effects are managed, that kind of thing. And we'll be seeing how Compose integrates with the other parts of the Kotlin infrastructure, how you can use it with coroutines, how you can use it with Ktor, etc., etc. So basically, we'll be covering Compose everywhere except where it's known best, everywhere apart from Android. So Compose as you haven't seen it before. That's the elevator pitch for the workshop.
And what are you most excited about teaching?
Well, Compose is a superb technology, but as I say, until recently, it's been limited to the Android community, to Android developers. So the really exciting thing is that we can show, and this is something that's still ongoing, how the technology is kind of being incrementally decoupled from Android, and made available everywhere, So for doing mad things with coroutines, even for doing command line applications, but for doing desktop applications and web applications.
Do you think Compose has a future as a Flutter competitor?
Oh, I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot barge because
I don't think I've seen Flutter on the command line.
Every time I'm at a GDE event, that comes up, and I have a few good friends who are deeply, deeply into their Flutter, So I don't touch that question without wearing some form of body armor, So yes, and Compose is better, But yes, but I won't touch that question.
Yes, you are safely behind a screen right now. Maybe don't talk about that in front of people at KotlinConf. What are some of the biggest challenges? What do you think the biggest challenges are for folks who want to learn multi-platform Compose?
Well, the Jetpack version of Compose is extremely well documented, and if you go out, you can find a ton of resources. But the other versions of Compose are still maturing. There are still features that are experimental. The APIs are still evolving. A lot of the tutorials are still being written and fleshed out, and so on. So the first issue I would say is simply that it's a moving target. But what new shiny thing in our industry isn't? So I'm hoping that one of the things that people will get out of the workshop is the impetus, that they need to teach themselves the remainder of the framework, and that the interest to stay current as it matures. So that would be the first thing, that it's a moving target. And then the second thing would be that Compose is a very idiomatic Kotlin technology. So it takes advantage of all the features of the language, free functions, lambdas with receivers, extension functions, all of that good stuff. It's all mixed in there. And that's great if you know the language well. You can actually look at a feature, and before you go near the documentation, you can kind of tell, how it's going to be implemented, because you know what kind of features they'll want to use and how they'll fit together and so on. But if you're new to the language, it can all be a bit daunting, So depending on the level of the people attending the workshops, that there might be a few gaps, that we need to fill in. But we'll fill in any language gaps as we go, and we'll try and illustrate how the different idioms of the Kotlin language facilitate Compose as a technology.
Have you been given any advanced notice on the audience at the workshop? Like,
we'll find out in advance. Yeah, we're going to try and send out some training needs evaluation type stuff, and get a sense of the people attending. But it's conference workshops are always very interesting because lots of different people can turn up. I've been a professional trainer for 20 years, and if you go into a particular company, well, you're the kind of people in that company. The background of the developers who will be attending the training, but at a conference, lots of different people turn up, and of course people get sick and have personal issues and get replaced by other people and so on. So even with the best will in the world, it can be very interesting on the first morning of a conference workshop, seeing who turns up. But that's part of the fun. That's what makes it interesting.
Definitely. So I wanted to ask you about, so Jake Borton said something about compose by any other name might have been sweeter. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that?
In terms of I'm not sure what he was saying there. Was it just...
I think it might have been more in terms of like people associate compose so closely with Android.
Yes. Yes,
no, absolutely. As well.
But I think that's going to be a transitory thing. I mean, I think it's like other technologies where, even Kotlin itself, Kotlin went through a period where it was the Android language, but then it broke away from that, and people these days know that Kotlin can be applied everywhere, on the cloud, on the desktop. There's lots of different places where you can apply Kotlin. So I think Compose is on that same journey. And yes, at the moment, it's very heavily identified with Android, but I think we can change that over time. So as it becomes better known as a multi-platform technology, and as Kotlin itself becomes better known as a multi-platform language, I think we can move that needle.
Excellent. So what's your biggest ambition, your big dream for the folks that attend this workshop?
I just hope that they will be inspired, and they'll get the big picture, as you say, that Compose isn't just for Android, and they'll gain enough confidence in Compose to take it back to their organizations. They'll try it out for internal applications, for proof of concepts, MVPs, all that kind of thing. And then in the fullness of time, they'll be able to use it for production applications. So yeah, just hope to inspire and enthuse people.
So when you started out with, when you heard about Compose for the first time, where were you on the spectrum? Were you dismissive, or were you more embracing? Where on the spectrum were you?
Well, I've been doing Android off and on for a very, very long time, and being an Android developer, I hate XML. So the technology set in Android. I was there back in the day, doing Android development on Eclipse, when it took like an hour to install everything and setting up the emulator.
Yeah, me too.
And, you know what it was like, and getting an activity with a text box and the button was like, yay, and then, the true horror of using Java for event handling, pre-Java, it would be anonymous in their classes and so on. So whenever Compose came out, and I actually think it might have been KotlinConf when I saw it for the first time, at the Google stand, somebody showed it to me. But I'm completely sold on the Kotlin idea of using DSLs. I think that's a wonderful idea. So being familiar with DSLs and teaching courses actually and creating DSLs in Kotlin, I immediately got the concept. And I think it's a brilliant idea. And I was really happy when I discovered that they weren't just limiting it to Android, that they were trying to decouple it and using it in other scenarios. And that's where the idea from the workshop came from.
Amazing.
The concept of a DSL, I think a lot of people know it in concept, and maybe they misuse it in practice. What sort of, talk more about DSLs? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, well, a DSL is just the idea that you have a limited scoped programming language. So we're all familiar with general purpose programming languages. You go out and you learn to program in Python and Ruby and Fortran, whatever it happens to be, and you have a general purpose programming language. A DSL is just the idea that we have a programming language that only works in a particular domain. It's only for a particular kind of programming. And I remember whenever I started in the industry in the 90s, there was a mad flurry of interest invest in external DSLs. So the idea was that, let's say you had 300 developers working in the fashion footwear industry, so you would create a programming language with its own compiler just for that particular industry. So in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a huge flurry of interest in external DSLs, limited programming languages with their own compilers. The problem was that this turned every company into JetBrains. So any company that adopted an external DSL, they then had to produce their own IDE, and effectively become a software tools company. So the first company I worked for in industry, very, very large company, they created their own specialist programming language for doing financial services, type applications. And they were literally maintaining their own IDE in this language. So external IDEs, external DSLs, not particularly maintainable. An internal DSL is just the idea where you use the functionality of your existing programming language to create another programming language within it. Okay, so the syntax of your programming language needs to be flexible enough that you can create and embed another more limited programming language inside it. And Ruby was definitely the first language that was really flexible and powerful enough to prove that this could be done. But Ruby, of course, is a dynamically typed language and therefore intrinsically evil in everybody who uses it. So if you cut me down the middle, it would say strongly typed. So DSLs are a great idea, but in the beginning, an internal DSL, it was really something that you did in scripting languages, but then more powerful languages like Kotlin came out, So one of the things that sold me in Kotlin in the early days is that the syntax has a lot of the wonderful features, I like from Ruby. You've got really good support for functional programming and so on, but you've actually got a compiler, And I know people who say that, look, compilers don't catch the kind of errors that I make. I envy those people. I make the kind of errors that the compilers catch. So I'm very happy to have a compiler working beside me and catching all of my errors. So Kotlin was one of the first languages that was incredibly powerful and yet at the same time strongly typed. So you could create an internal DSL and the compiler and the IDE and so on would keep you right. And that's why you have tools like Gradle, which moved from a Groovy-based DSL to a Kotlin-based DSL, because whenever you're working with very large, complicated build files, you really need a certain amount of structure there, a certain amount of stability. You need the compiler and the IDE helping you. So I'm a huge fan of DSLs and the whole concept.
In terms of compose, you were talking early on when we were talking. How long ago was it? It feels like we've been talking for a long time, but I know we haven't. You're just so engaging, and I wish I could be in your workshop. But you were talking about the difference between the compose UI and the compose runtime. Mm-hmm. And I know that the UI allows it to, or because it has a runtime, allows it to do things like working in the command line, yes, or on desktop or some other places, yes, even on the web. Yes. So
you have composable functions, and composable functions call other composable functions and so on. And what this enables is that the composable functions all emit nodes, so you get a tree of nodes created. And then that tree of nodes is going to be asked to in some way generate something. Okay. So normally whenever we say generate something, we mean render, and that's where your compose UI comes in. So the composable functions have emitted a tree of nodes, and then each of the nodes in those trees is going to render, something into the user interface. So if you were using Compose for the web, for example, what they would actually be rendering is DOM nodes, and all the DOM nodes get put together into a mini tree, and that mini tree gets put into the big tree, which is the HTML document, and then you actually see something in the browser. Or if you're using it for the GUI, well, then they're rendering themselves on the screen in some way. But that's the difference between the runtime and the UI side of things. The runtime is the thing that's creating the tree and recreating the tree, as the state you're working with changes. And the runtime doesn't care what the tree is actually going to generate at the end of the day. So I don't know if anybody's ever tried to do it, but you could use it in theory for refactorings or something. If you were actually generating the abstract syntax tree that a compiler produces from the syntax of your program, so you could apply it to things like that, so anywhere you have a tree type structure and you're generating something from a tree type structure, you can use the compose runtime. But obviously the compose UI side of things, that's only going to be where you're doing GUIs.
That is super interesting.
Come to the workshop.
I wasn't going to bring up Flutter again, but when you said compose rendering the DOM on the web, I remember Flutter. I think it used to do that, and now it renders to a canvas. I'm not going to ask you about Flutter, but what are your thoughts on, for the web, like rendering to DOM versus canvas?
Oh, I am not experienced enough in that area to say anything, I'm afraid. So I shall withdraw from that one with good grace. As I say, I have too many friends who are passionately into Flutter, and they will, if I misrepresent their technology, they will never let me live it down. So I shall humbly walk away from that one if you don't mind. Yeah.
They will remove five pieces of ingredients of your 15s and take it out of your fridge, and you'll have 10s.
They'll take my 3 weeks away. Yeah. Yes,
no, we love our Flutter folks too.
Left, I'll be left with a plate of mint caramel squares or something for misbehaving.
But hopefully they'll be the mint ones. Hopefully
Yes.
they'll be the mint ones.
I second that.
Garth, thank you so much for spending time with us and explaining all kinds of different things to us, and telling us about your workshop. We can see you're super excited about it, and you're super ready for it.
KotlinConf is always great. I think this will be, I can't remember if it'll be my 4th or 5th KotlinConf. I'm really, really looking forward to it. It's a tremendous bunch of people, and we always have a marvelous time. So yeah.
Yes. And so that's all, folks. We're going to be ending our podcast now. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending time with us, and have a great day further wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.